I was leading a seminar on citizenship when a student posed a question that gave me pause. She asked what occurs when an individual stands for two distinct places simultaneously and whose priorities they truly advance. I explained this represents one of the most enduring questions in political thought, and history consistently provides the same answer. Serving two masters proves impossible, a choice becomes inevitable, and whichever side you don't choose will permanently lose faith in you. This exchange returned to my thoughts recently as I observed developments surrounding Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. I want to clarify what I'm observing here. This isn't about a single incident or isolated controversy. I'm identifying a recurring pattern I've witnessed repeatedly throughout history, one that invariably concludes the same way. Omar serves Minnesota's 5th district, which contains a substantial Somali population. She arrived as a refugee, obtained citizenship, and won election to Congress. This embodies the American narrative. Immigrate here, become American, engage in democratic processes. However, I'm watching something develop that fascinates me as someone who examines how these situations unfold. Omar has been counseling her Somali constituents on managing interactions with immigration enforcement, informing them of their rights, advising them on avoiding certain questions, and guiding them on what to withhold. She might contend this constitutes merely legal guidance, and everyone possesses rights. That's reasonable. Yet Republicans are demanding her deportation. A Texas congressman is circulating petitions. Elon Musk claims she's violating the law. Other representatives are insisting on investigations. That represents the surface narrative everyone discusses. But that doesn't interest me. What captures my attention is the underlying pattern. I've observed this pattern previously in Athens, in Rome, in every republic that has existed. If history serves as a guide, I can predict precisely how this concludes. When I farmed, I discovered something about irrigation systems. You cannot water two fields in opposing directions using the same pump. The physics don't permit it. Water flows downhill. You must select which field receives water first. You can alternate, certainly, but at any specific moment, one field gets water while the other doesn't. Politics functions identically. Loyalty isn't unlimited. Resources aren't unlimited. Time isn't unlimited. When representing people, you constantly make choices about whose priorities take precedence. These choices expose where your genuine loyalties rest. Representative government depends entirely on one straightforward concept. The person you elect prioritizes your interests above their own interests and above other groups' interests. That's the arrangement. That's why we term it representation. But what occurs when a representative maintains divided loyalty? What happens when they attempt serving two different communities with two different sets of priorities? History reveals exactly what happens. And it's never positive. Consider Alcibiades, a brilliant Athenian general and politician, charismatic and intelligent, a rising figure in Athenian politics. When Athens turned against him, he defected to Sparta and began advising Athens' adversaries on defeating Athens. When Sparta turned against him, he went to Persia, then returned to Athens, then departed again. He continuously attempted serving multiple masters, repeatedly switching allegiances based on personal benefit. The result? Nobody trusted him. Not Athens, not Sparta, not Persia. He ended up assassinated in exile, trusted by no one, abandoned by all. Everyone eventually understood that when someone maintains divided loyalty, they possess loyalty only to themselves. The Athenians documented this extensively. Thucydides recorded case after case of politicians attempting to play both sides. Every single instance ended in disaster, not merely for the politician, but for the entire city. Divided loyalty generates a particular kind of political poison. It breeds suspicion universally. When citizens cannot trust that their representatives prioritize the city's interests foremost, they cease participating. They stop believing in the system. They begin seeking strong leaders who at least make their allegiances clear. That's how republics perish, not from external conquest, but from internal distrust. I'm not claiming Omar is Alcibiades. but I am stating the pattern is recognizable. When politicians begin prioritizing ethnic or religious identity over the interests of those who elected them, voters notice. Once voters notice, trust evaporates. What's developing that nobody truly discusses is this. The Trump administration focuses on immigration enforcement. That's no secret. They campaigned on it, won on it, and are implementing it. You can agree or disagree with the policy, but it's occurring. If you're a representative whose district includes a significant population potentially affected by that enforcement, you face choices. You can work within the system to modify the law, propose legislation, build coalitions, make arguments. That's how the system operates. Or you can position yourself as protector of one specific ethnic group against the government you're part of. Omar selected the second path. That choice carries consequences. Once you position yourself as defender of one ethnic group against the broader society, you cannot easily reverse that. You've made a choice about who your people are. Everyone else notices. The Somali community views her as their advocate, which explains their support. But everyone else in Minnesota begins asking a different question. Does she represent Minnesota, or does she represent Somalia? Once that question gets asked, it never disappears. I observed something similar while teaching at Fresno State. We held debates about whether university resources should be allocated based on ethnic identity or academic merit. Sounds abstract, but it wasn't abstract to the involved students. Once you start making decisions based on ethnic identity, everyone begins thinking in those terms. Asian students start questioning why they're treated one way. White students question why they're treated another way. Hispanic students form their own caucuses. And soon you don't have a university community anymore. You have competing ethnic factions sharing a campus. The same occurs in politics. Once ethnic identity becomes the organizing principle, civic identity dissolves. Rome faced this identical problem with barbarian generals. Rome would recruit military leaders from Germanic tribes, grant them Roman citizenship, place them in command of Roman legions. Everything appeared fine until it wasn't. When those generals had to choose between their birth tribe and Rome, many selected their tribe. They'd employ Roman training, Roman equipment, Roman tactics, but they'd use them against Rome. Or they'd negotiate arrangements benefiting their ethnic kinsmen at Rome's expense. The most famous case was Alaric, a Visigothic general who served in the Roman army, received citizenship, and rose through the ranks. But ultimately, he led his Visigoths to sack Rome itself in 410 AD. Why? Because he never truly became Roman. He remained Visigothic. His identity never shifted. When his interests and Rome's interests diverged, he chose his people over Rome. Rome learned an expensive lesson. You can grant someone citizenship, power, and position, but you cannot force them to identify with the civilization that provided those things. Identity runs deeper than paperwork. Am I suggesting Omar will take up arms against America? Obviously not. This isn't the 5th century. But the underlying dynamic remains identical. The question of where someone's deepest loyalty resides never disappears. Right now, through her actions and choices, Omar is answering that question. Perhaps not as she intends, but she's answering it nonetheless. Omar won her district because of identity politics. First Somali American in Congress. First Muslim woman. Historic first. The progressive narrative embraces that story. Her district contains enough Somali voters to form a decisive bloc. So she doubled down on that identity. Makes sense politically, dance with who brought you. But here's the problem with identity politics. Once you base your entire political brand on representing one specific ethnic or religious group, you cannot pivot when circumstances change. You're locked in, and circumstances are changing. The Trump administration enforces immigration law more aggressively than the previous administration. Public opinion on immigration has shifted dramatically. Even Democratic voters express concerns about border security. The political environment that elevated Omar is shifting beneath her feet, but she cannot shift with it because her entire political identity wraps around being the defender of one specific community. If she moderates, she loses that community. But if she doesn't moderate, she alienates everyone else. That's the trap of identity politics. It works excellently when political winds blow in your direction, but when they shift, you have nowhere to go. I'm watching those winds shift right now. Immigration enforcement will increase in Minnesota. Some of Omar's constituents will be affected. Not thousands at once, not in one dramatic sweep, but steadily, consistently. People here illegally or whose status is questionable will face consequences. Omar will face an impossible choice. She can continue positioning herself as protector of illegal immigrants, keeping her Somali base happy, but making herself toxic to everyone else, including Minnesota Democrats who need to win statewide races. Or she can moderate her position, acknowledge that immigration law exists and requires enforcement, but that alienates the community that put her in office. Either way, she loses. In representative government, when people stop trusting that you represent them, they stop voting for you. Simple as that. Omar's district is heavily Democratic, heavily progressive. She's probably safe in her seat for a while, but she's becoming a liability to other Democrats. When trying to win a Senate race in Minnesota, you don't want association with someone who's become the face of opposing immigration enforcement. Democrats in Minnesota will start distancing themselves from her, quietly at first, then more openly, because political survival requires reading which way the wind blows. The wind is blowing against open borders, against identity politics, against politicians who seem more loyal to ethnic groups than to America. Watch what happens when politicians prioritize ethnic identity over civic identity. Watch what happens to trust, to social cohesion, to the political coalition. When you farm, you learn that certain decisions have cascading effects. You plant the wrong crop in the wrong field, and 3 years later, you're still dealing with the consequences. Soil depletion, pest problems, market difficulties. I remember one season I decided to skip crop rotation because grain prices were high. I planted wheat 3 years consecutively in the same field. Made good money the first 2 years. Third year, the soil was depleted. Pests had built up. Disease spread faster because the pathogens were already established. Lost half the crop. It took 5 years to restore that field to normal productivity. 5 years of reduced yields while I rebuilt what I destroyed, chasing short-term profits. Politics works the same way. The decisions politicians make today about identity and loyalty cascade forward. They affect everything that follows. Omar made a decision. Perhaps she didn't realize she was making it. Perhaps she thought she could have it both ways. But you can't. You're either representing Americans who happen to include Somalis, or you're representing Somalis who happen to be in America. Those are two different things, and voters can discern the difference. America has always been a country of immigrants. That's not controversial, just history. People came from everywhere. Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, every country on earth. For most of American history, there was an understanding. You came here, you became American. You could keep your culture, your food, your music, your religion, but your primary identity became American. That's what made the whole thing work. Diversity without divisiveness. Multiple backgrounds united by common civic identity. But somewhere in recent decades, that understanding broke down. Now, we're told that maintaining ethnic identity is more important than developing civic identity. We're told that assimilation is bad, that melting pot is oppressive, that people should maintain primary loyalty to their ethnic or religious community. Politicians like Omar are the result of that shift. She's not an aberration or accident. She's the logical outcome of identity politics taken to its conclusion. America is about to learn the hard way why that doesn't work. History teaches that multi-ethnic societies only work when there's a common identity superseding ethnic identity. Rome worked when barbarians became Romans first and barbarians second. Rome collapsed when they stayed barbarians who happened to live in Roman territory. Same pattern every time. When I taught courses on political philosophy, I'd always spend time on Aristotle's concept of citizenship. He argued that citizens need something in common, some shared understanding of justice, of the good life, of what the political community is for. Without that common understanding, you don't have a political community. You just have different groups living in the same place, competing for resources and power. Aristotle called this the difference between a city and a mere alliance. An alliance is just people cooperating for mutual advantage. A city is people who share a common conception of the good life. America used to be a city in Aristotle's sense. Now it's becoming an alliance, and alliances are fragile. They break apart when interests diverge. That's what's developing in America right now. Omar is a symptom of it. Watch where politicians place their loyalty. Not what they say, but what they do. When there's a conflict between their ethnic community and the broader society, which side do they take? That tells you everything. Understand that this pattern is playing out in cities across America. It's not just Minnesota. Look at Dearborn, Michigan. Look at parts of California. Look at any place with large immigrant populations where politicians are rising to power based purely on ethnic identity. Watch what happens to those places. Watch what happens to civic trust, to social cohesion. Watch the crime rates. Watch the school performance. Watch whether businesses want to invest there. When civic identity breaks down, everything else starts breaking down too. It's not immediate, it's gradual, but it's predictable. Make decisions based on what you're actually seeing, not what you're told to believe. You're told that diversity is strength. Fine. But watch whether diverse communities with identity-based politics actually function better or worse than communities with strong civic identity. Use your eyes. Use your judgment. Don't let anyone tell you that what you're observing isn't real. If you're in one of these cities, prepare for the consequences of divided loyalty among your representatives. They're not going to put your interests first. They're going to put their community's interests first. Plan accordingly. That might mean moving, changing how you vote, building alternative networks, putting your kids in different schools, starting a business somewhere else. Whatever it means, don't wait until the problems become acute, because by then your options are limited. Understand that this isn't sustainable. America can't function long-term with politicians whose primary loyalty is to ethnic or religious communities rather than to America. Something's going to break. Maybe it's a political realignment. Maybe it's a backlash against identity politics. Maybe it's something else. But the current trajectory doesn't lead anywhere good. The question is whether you're positioned to weather that break or whether you're going to be caught unprepared when it happens. Carthage was a multi-ethnic empire with a Phoenician core, but they recruited soldiers from all over the Mediterranean, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, whoever would fight for money. It worked for a while. Carthage built an empire with mercenary armies. They conquered territory, controlled trade routes, became wealthy and powerful. But when Carthage got in real trouble, when they were fighting for survival against Rome in the Punic Wars, those mercenary armies weren't reliable. They had no loyalty to Carthage. They were fighting for money, not for civilization. When the money ran out, or when Rome offered them a better deal, they switched sides, or went home, or simply stopped fighting. There's a famous incident after the First Punic War. Carthage couldn't pay its mercenaries. The soldiers mutinied. They besieged Carthage itself. The city that had hired them to fight its enemies nearly fell to its own army because there was no loyalty, no shared identity, no reason for those soldiers to suffer hardship for Carthage's sake. Rome, meanwhile, had citizen soldiers, men who saw themselves as Romans first, who had a stake in Rome's survival, who fought harder because they were defending their own civilization, their own families, their own way of life. When Roman legions lost a battle, They regrouped and fought again. When they ran out of money, they fought anyway. When the situation looked hopeless, they kept fighting. Not because they were better warriors, but because they had something Carthaginian mercenaries didn't have: identity, loyalty, commitment to something larger than themselves. That's why Rome won the Punic Wars. That's why Rome conquered the Mediterranean, while Carthage was destroyed so completely that the Romans literally salted the earth so nothing would grow there. The difference wasn't tactics or technology. The difference was identity. Apply that lesson to America in 2025. You have politicians who see themselves as representatives of specific ethnic or religious communities. Their loyalty is to that community, not to America as a whole. And you have voters who are starting to notice, starting to ask questions, starting to wonder if maybe there's a problem with this arrangement. That's what's happening with Omar. That's why Republicans are calling for her deportation. Not because they actually think she's going to be deported, but because they're making a point. They're saying out loud what many people are thinking quietly. If you're more loyal to Somalia than to America, why are you in Congress? That question is being asked, and it's not going away. The interesting thing is that Republicans used to be scared to ask that question. They'd be called racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, all the usual accusations. But something's changed. They're asking the question anyway, and voters are listening because voters have figured something out. They figured out that accusations of racism don't actually answer the underlying question. Does this person represent America or does she represent Somalia? That's a legitimate question. Calling people racist for asking it doesn't make the question disappear. Based on pattern recognition from history, Omar is going to become increasingly isolated. Within a few years, she'll be politically toxic, even to other Democrats. She'll hold her seat because her district is locked in. But she won't have influence. She won't be able to get legislation passed. She won't be effective because effectiveness in Congress requires building coalitions. And you can't build coalitions when nobody trusts that you're putting America's interests first. She'll become like those barbarian generals who technically served Rome, but everyone knew where their real loyalty lay: useful for specific purposes, never trusted with anything important, always watched, always suspect. The broader pattern will continue. Other politicians who built their careers on identity politics will face the same trajectory, because America is waking up to the fact that identity politics doesn't work. It creates division, it prevents assimilation, it makes governance impossible. Eventually, voters reject it. Not all at once, not uniformly, but steadily, predictably. You're watching it happen right now. Politics isn't just about policy. It's about loyalty, it's about identity, it's about who you serve and why. When politicians demonstrate divided loyalty, they lose effectiveness. They lose trust, they lose the ability to represent anyone effectively. Omar is learning that lesson right now. She probably doesn't realize it yet. She probably thinks this is just another controversy that will blow over. But the pattern is unmistakable to anyone who knows history. Are you paying attention? Are you watching the pattern develop? Are you preparing for what comes next? What comes next is predictable. Identity politics is going to break down. It has to. It's not sustainable. America doesn't work when politicians represent ethnic groups instead of Americans. The only question is how much damage gets done before people figure that out. In Rome, they figured it out too late. The empire had already filled up with barbarian generals whose loyalty was questionable. By the time Roman citizens realized the problem, the institutions were too weak to fix it. The army was full of Germans who didn't care about Roman civilization. The bureaucracy was full of people who saw their positions as opportunities to enrich themselves and their kinsmen, not as duties to Rome. When the crisis came, when the empire needed people who would sacrifice for the common good, those people weren't there anymore. Everyone was looking out for their own ethnic group, their own tribe, their own narrow interests. That's how empires collapse, not from external invasion, but from internal dissolution. America still has time, but the window's closing. Politicians like Omar are showing you the problem clearly. They're making the choice visible. ethnic identity versus civic identity, particular community versus the country as a whole, voters are going to have to decide which kind of representation they want. History has decided every single time the societies that maintain strong civic identity survived, the societies that dissolved into competing ethnic factions collapsed. There are no exceptions to this pattern, none. Watch what happens with Omar. Watch how her political influence changes over the next few years. Watch whether she can build coalitions or whether she becomes isolated. Watch whether other Democrats defend her or distance themselves from her. Because what happens to her is going to happen to every politician who makes the same choice she made. Divided loyalty loses every time throughout all of history. That's not my opinion. That's just how it works. No amount of good intentions or progressive rhetoric changes that fundamental reality. The pattern is playing out right now in Minnesota, in Michigan, in cities across America. You can either prepare for it or be surprised by it. Your choice. But don't say you weren't warned. Don't say nobody saw it coming. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to look at history instead of listening to ideology. America works when people become Americans. It breaks down when they stay foreigners who happen to live here. That's the lesson. That's always been the lesson. Omar is about to teach it to a whole new generation of Americans who thought maybe this time it would be different. It won't be, because human nature doesn't change. Political dynamics don't change. The requirements for successful multi-ethnic republics don't change. Watch carefully. Learn the lesson. Adjust accordingly. Because reality doesn't care about your politics or mine. It just is. And smart people base their decisions on reality, not on wishful thinking about how they want reality to be.